Today, in December 5th, 2025, we're here today to start back on my video and podcasts. And I'd like to start with a couple things, kind of distinct topics, but one that is near and dear to me personally. I just read in the news today about, and it really kind of not only surprised me, actually it shocked me a little bit, in that uh, what the political winds of Ohio are right now, and how the current governor of Ohio differed with his party's push in the state legislature, the supermajority state legislature, Republican state legislature, that pushed all year to loosen the limits on teenage children's school year work limitations in a law that has been in existence since 1988. The Republican state legislature in both the House and the Senate had pushed and proposed all year long, and they finally got it passed recently through their party line vote that they were going to loosen the limits on when 14 and 15-year-olds can work on school nights. They were going to, currently the law, which is something that I want to get into, that exists currently, and which DeWine surprisingly upheld in a veto against his state legislature's current efforts to loosen it. The law says you cannot work past 7 p.m., a 14 or 15-year-old, during a school year. We personally put that together. Hi, Shadow. Welcome, Shadow, my Black Panther. Um, this law was created back in 1987-88 largely by myself, and that's why it's near and dear to my heart. The current limitations that exist in Ohio on teenage school employment across all of Ohio was something I personally helped research, develop, then proposed to the then governor, Richard Celeste, and he said he wanted to go with it, and we needed it. And there was a lot of effort put into getting this proposal into the legislature, and then I became the lead proponent witness, they call it. In other words, I was the one in the dock answering the questions before the State Labor Committee, the House State Labor Committee. And the Democrats controlled the state legislature in those days, so it wasn't too hard of a sell to this overall majority. But we had very serious Republican leaders of that era, some of which would go on to become governors and senators and other prominent statewide Republican politicians, and names that lasted down through the decades, opposing that effort. And so today, DeWine vetoes a bill that was passed by the Ohio state legislature, supermajority Republican legislature, that would have allowed the teenagers to work till 9 p.m. on school nights in any kind of job, making the federal minimum wage $7.25 an hour, which is lower than Ohio's minimum wage, and they would have be able to work with parental approval. It sounds reasonable enough for some teenagers, but the reason why we passed this law was we found back in 1987-88 there were no limits at that time on any child labor hours of employment, including the school year. And I found that, and I discovered that while working as the in-house counsel for the State Department of Prevailing Wage, Minimum Wage, and Minor Labor Law Division. It was called the department was called the Department of Industrial Relations in those days, and our division, the labor division that I worked in, was the Wage and Hour Division and Minor Labor Laws. So we were responsible for enforcing these laws, and there were no laws, no limitations in those days, ever in Ohio's history, on when you can work a 13, 14, even a 12-year-old, really, particularly 14, 15-year-olds, 16, 17-year-olds on school nights. And there were very serious waves of occurrences occurring across the country, and it was catching the attention of federal officials, educators, social scientists, and sociologists across the country were writing about this phenomenon where kids were being employed by the fast food industry mainly, and they were doing it to their detriment. And it was a very interesting dynamic that we got into in those days. And I began to lead the research and the effort. And I proposed a change to the state's absence of having a law. And Governor Celeste, to his credit, took that up and said, we need to do this. So when we proposed that, it went to the state legislature. One of the state legislatures, legislative committee, wrote the new limits that we proposed, which was not allowing the teenagers to work who were 14 and 15-year-olds past 7, and for 16 and 17-year-olds they had to work. They could only work till 9 on those nights, and even then there were limits, strict limits on how many hours. So I've been proud of that law, and with all my life and all the things I went through, ups and downs, and some of the achievements that I've made after that, and some of the things that some of the mistakes we've made, and I've gone through in my life, that law has stood the test of time, and it gives me great satisfaction to think that millions of school children have been protected in Ohio since we passed that law in 1988. DeWine surprisingly vetoed the current Republican push to loosen those limits on school nights for teenagers who were 14 or 15. The most vulnerable ones of the whole teenage market that can be employed, the youngest ones, were going to be loosened with quote unquote parental approval so they could work till 9 o'clock on a school night. I'm very, very happy and very, very surprised, but and rightfully so supportive of DeWine's decision to veto this very interesting grab for cheap children's labor again in Ohio. It was interesting that the state legislature's business community was lobbying for this, and the fast food industry was lobbying for this change to occur. I find it very curious because while the Trump administration and the state legislature follows Trump's administration almost to, if not outdoes it, to a point of mimicking to mediocrity into every single aspect of Ohio's laws, including religious tenets and changing the university curriculums of the state and high school teachers, what they can teach and what they can't teach, getting into things that conservatives always claimed for 100 years, that government's too big, and the Ronald Reagan idea that the best government is a small government, and all this idea, yet they were reaching into the very most private, formerly almost sacred arenas, which no one, no governmental official, right or left, ever thought of getting into, guiding curriculums from the state legislature into what can be taught in a university classroom. And now that's law in Ohio, and Ohio State, Ohio University, and many universities in Ohio are struggling with can we teach now, what can we do in our curriculums given this Ohio overreach, Republican overreach. Well, surprisingly, in one of his last stands against his own supermajority legislature, DeWine has stood up and said, we don't need to change the children's law. It's been working effectively for 35 years, and there's no need to go to the place where we need to employ children as young as 14 till 9 o'clock at night on a school night. There's no need for that. And I'm so relieved, because even though the Democrats had opposed this change, and some Democrats had spoken pretty effectively against this push by this past year for the Republican legislatures on both the House and Senate to get this law up to DeWine's desk. They didn't have the juice. They don't have the political weight, the votes to counter anything the Republicans do. They know that. And I don't think any Republicans voted against this proposal. Very few, if any, voted against the majority Republican move to change and loosen the standards of Ohio's child labor laws. I find it curious that during this period, while we're deporting the many Latinos, hardworking Latinos, and hardworking families, and women, and young Latinos who are graduating high school and university right out of their ceremonial moments of accepting their degrees, and we're taking them and putting them in ICE detention centers, and we're taking daycare mothers off out of their daycares, and we're going into religious places of worship and stripping so-called illegal aliens out of this country, and we're making sure that the fruit pickers and the cabbage pickers and the office furniture workers that are in these factories that are already here illegally, but they're working, and those that are putting their roofs on our houses, and mowing our lawns and doing corporate work, and in our hotels that are folding our beds down at night. These are the people that Trump's administration is targeting, the Republicans target. It's curious, in that milieu, in that environment that's controversial at best, they're passing child labor laws to allow more children to work longer hours on school nights. I think that says it all about the Republican Party. It says everything about what they view the American workforce as. They say, oh, this is good for children to learn how to work, the values of hard work. That's ridiculous. And if you study this issue, and if you know anything about this issue, which I did study, and I spent over a year and a half straight working with superintendents from major urban centers like Cincinnati and Columbus and other smaller venues, and working with even lobbyists and lawyers for Wendy's in headquarters in Columbus. I personally went to their headquarters and spoke with them about. After we spoke with them, after we talked about what our proposals were going to be, they were fully on board. They might have been reluctantly, but they realized that they could not, in that era, fight the imaging, the optics, they call it today, of wanting to employ children on school nights at any time. And again, in that era, there were no limits whatsoever. We instituted those limits for the first time in Ohio's history. And I was really, really proud to lead that effort. I led that effort inside the state labor department. It eventually passed the labor committee. It was brought out of the labor committee. Vernon Riffe was the speaker. He was the man. Everybody knew that Vernon Riffe was the man. Once he got behind a bill in that era, it was going to pass. So it wasn't a matter of fact that whether we had a chance to pass it. But what was interesting is key leading Republicans, multimillionaire Republicans, opposed that bill, as they opposed the minimum wage bill that was conjoined with it. The first time in Ohio's history, we raised the minimum wage also in that same legislative era, in that same bill. We married the minimum wage increase with the child labor limitations. We did that in 1987, 1988. So, but people like George Winovich, who would go on to become governor and U.S. senator, he was on that labor committee in the House. A gentleman named Robert Taft, who was a grandson of the President Taft from Cincinnati, he was on that committee, and he opposed and he questioned me. And there was Betty Jo Davidson, who would become George W. Bush's key financial director in the state of Ohio's campaign, that pushed Bush over for his re-election bid when Ohio put him over and allowed him to have a second term. It was Betty Jo Davidson's fundraising efforts and key Republican leadership in the state party. She was on that committee, and she opposed. And there was another 2 or 3 other key Republicans that were on the committee that opposed those efforts to raise the minimum wage and to put these limits on child labor laws, even then in 1988. So I was around 30 years of age, give or take a year, when we put that law together. And after that committee hearing, and we knew that we were going to be able to get it through the committee and onto the General Assembly vote, I was given a toast by Vernon Riffe himself, and many state legislatures came up to me and shook my hand back at the little bar back in those days that everybody would retire to after the legislative sessions were over. It was behind, near the Columbus Dispatch building, behind the State House. And I forget the name of the bar now, but it was the watering hole where most of the legislative affairs were concluded and decided. And and I retired there, and everyone, including labor leaders and union officials and other prominent Democratic officials, walked up to my table and greeted me, and we put a thumbs up. And again, when Vernon Riffe holds up a glass and toast you in front of the entire caucus that's now imbibing themselves after the session near Christmas at the end of the year, it's a pretty heady moment for a 30-year-old, because the place goes silent when Vernon Riffe raises his glass, and he mentions hair to Mr. Oliveto, for the young Oliveto, for doing this work. And it was a moment that brimmed with promise and hope, and also a lot of fulfillment, a sense of great fulfillment. And it went on to come out of the legislature. Harry Michel from Youngstown, the great Harry Michel, brilliant Columbia Law grad, I believe. I knew Harry Michel. He led us pastors through the state senate in those days. Bob Birch was in the state senate in those days. We had tremendous statewide conscientious Democratic leaders in those days, with powerful union. Tom Sawyer was on the labor committee. He was Mr. Boggs was the chairman of that committee. Tim Scott, or Tom Roberts, who's now the head of the NBCP in the state of Ohio the last 7 years, 8 years. He was on that labor committee. And then Jerry Kopinski was from my hometown of Steubenville. He was also kind of quiet, silent, and didn't ask me too many questions, but I got a lot of support from the leadership during the testifying on behalf of that bill and the proposal, as a lead proponent, witness in favor of the administration's efforts to put those limits in. I am very, very happy that Governor DeWine found it in his conscience and his heart to reject his own Republican supermajority party's efforts to put children at risk again on school nights that were young as 14 and 15, while they so-called enjoyed their work experience in the state of Ohio. It is not necessary, and he must have found out that the research supports that. Statewide educators and superintendents of the urban districts know that the performance of children working at that age till 9 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night or any time is a very serious detriment to their educational ability. And yes, they will work, and yes, they will want to work, and yes, their parents will want to work because it's income. And a lot of families today especially want that income. But children should not be the main source of making it past the ability to get your household bills paid. And because they may want a new Nintendo, in those days they may want a new used automobile, or some football, or something that they wanted in their lives in those days. The idea was, children will work, and they will want to work, and they'll neglect their studies, they'll neglect their education, and some, even more seriously, will literally, and this was proven, will literally die on the way to school the next morning because they've worked so late into the night. Because what happens eventually, if you have these limits loosened, the corporations, the power of local fast food industry franchises in the middle of a desolate area like Zanesville, will work these kids till 1 and 2 in the morning. And that we proved that was happening. And there were incidents in which children actually died in car accidents. They were a little bit older. They were 15, 16-year-olds. They had a license. But because they worked at 2 in the morning, they woke up, they were tired, and they literally drove themselves off the road in a wintry day and killed themselves. And we presented this research to the state legislature. So this is a serious issue. I've been proud for most of my life that I had such a critical role to play in the passage of one of Ohio's most progressive laws on the books, and it was passed in an era in which the Democrats' leadership saw the wisdom of that, including Governor Celeste, and he needs a lot of credit for that. And Governor Celeste was a very bright man, a Rhodes Scholar, went on to become a college president. He he got behind the proposal that I gave to the administration, and I personally, through the right channels, sent it up to his desk, and he put the thumbs up on it, including the first ever increase in the state's minimum wage. It went from $2.10 an hour in those days to $3.35, and that was part of the bill that passed along with this children's limitations bill. I'm very proud of that, and those efforts have, throughout my life, no matter where I've been, and even though I've gone through some low times and like life brings its challenges, I always look back on the fact that millions of school children in Ohio were protected by some efforts made by some young people in the state labor department, including myself, in the state Democratic Party leadership that actually was very, very much interested in the public good, and especially the public welfare of our children, our greatest resources in this country. Thank you.